Ancient history is not exactly as well understood as mainstream historians would like you to believe. Now, this is fairly self-evident. However, most people don't actually realize how little we technically know when it comes to understanding what has happened in the past. Now, there are a few reasons why we find ourselves in this situation. And the first reason is really the fact that as Western civilization has advanced technologically, what has happened is that as people get used to what we would consider, the new sciences, the new technologies, really being able to quantify something right in front of us, really being able to prove that something exists beyond the shadow of a doubt. And I don't just mean something basic exists, I mean like some pretty complex principles that without technology, you would never be able to measure or really get an understanding of. So as we have gotten to that point to where our technology tells us all kinds of stuff, the byproduct of this is that the vast majority of people now rely on the technology to explain the real world to them, and when that technology no longer provides an answer to a question, that means the question must be inherently wrong. Right? Because if the technology cannot prove the answer, then a lot of people nowadays are going to assume that the question is either fallacious, outright wrong, or stupid, or whatever. Basically, the question becomes a non-issue because we can't explain it. And if we cannot explain something today in the modern world, then it must be ridiculous. And so that's the way the vast majority of people look at problems that we are trying to solve. So essentially, because we are so technologically advanced, we have now decided that there are certain questions with respect to not only science, but of course history, that are no longer valid. And the reason why they are not technically valid anymore to the vast majority of the population is because our sciences don't supply an immediate answer. And this is the problem, because right now in mainstream society, all of Western society, we have a psychological scourge that is right now sweeping over every single facet of society that we live in. And that's the scourge of instant gratification. One of the unfortunate situations that your average Westerner now finds themselves in, whether you know it or not, is a situation to where you expect to either have an answer given to you fairly immediately, you expect to have your packages delivered fairly immediately, you expect to essentially have everything in life delivered to you at a breakneck speed. And the reason why we expect that now is because we have been trained to expect it. Makes sense. If we are trained to do something, then we are probably going to do it. Now, what technology has done is it has indeed trained everybody in the Western world to expect instant gratification. Now, this is a bad thing psychologically, first of all, and it opens the door for all kinds of ways to be exploited. But the other problem is that it actually affects the human physiology as well. So, I didn't really want to talk about all this, but now let's talk about a little bit of this. So, the other problem with instant gratification getting in our way of trying to figure out problems is the fact that once you get used to having all of your needs met almost instantaneously, what happens is that your body will create dopamine, which then feeds your dopamine receptors, which then in turn makes you feel euphoric about whatever immediate gratification thing that you just received. Now, the problem with this is that dopamine receptors will adapt to the amount of dopamine that your body is creating when you are getting instantly gratified. Essentially, your body will create more dopamine receptors so that you can feel more of the dopamine. But there is a problem. Eventually, your body will create so many dopamine receptors that you will not be able to generate enough dopamine naturally to fill them all up. Once the human body gets to this point, you will literally start to feel physical withdrawals. This is one of the huge problems that we actually face in society right now. You want to know one of the main areas where depression comes from? It's this. It's the fact that people are no longer able to satisfy the demand that all of those new dopamine receptors are asking for. So what your average person does, of course, is they start looking around and trying to figure out how they can, how they can get that instant gratification that will essentially give them that high. So what we've now found in general society, in Western society, is that now everybody's dopamine receptors are beyond fried. Because people's dopamine receptors are fried, they now generally lack the capability to delay gratification for something that they are trying to achieve. Now, I'm not going to go any further, into society's problems and all that garbage, but I did want to lay a foundation so that we could all understand that the problem that we are currently suffering in mainstream society with respect to trying to figure out what happened in the past is directly related to what is going on in modern society with respect to how our civilization is run. Now, when we look back in the past, we find ourselves staring at some pretty serious problems. And those problems range from everything to looking back at mythologies and trying to figure out why the hell our ancestors imagined all of this crazy stuff going on in the past. The serious question arises, who the hell was our ancient ancestors' drug dealer? Because holy crap, right? They're talking about some of the most insane concepts. And when we look around today, none of that stuff is really going on. So that's a problem, right? That causes an issue for historians. And then there's other simpler problems that we do not have answers to, such as how did a particular civilization farm a certain area? It could be as basic as that. We're missing answers for all of these kinds of historical issues. So this is where instant gratification becomes an issue. Because your average person who gets into history has been 100% affected by Western propaganda and basic Western society. And of course, once you are affected by all of that, you unfortunately are going to demand a certain level of instant gratification. So when you get into historical studies and you start looking around at all of these different questions that exist, and the reality is we don't know anything about our history. It's hilarious about how very little humans really truly understand about our past. I mean, this is an objective fact, by the way. Anyway, when historians start to look at this stuff, the vast majority of the time, there is not going to be a ready-made answer. Now, on one hand, you might be like, well, yeah, of course, that's the point of being a historian. We're supposed to try and figure this stuff out. And I agree completely. The problem is that a lot of people, nowadays especially, are not interested in doing that. And there's multiple reasons for this happening. It's not just the instant gratification thing. There's a lot of psychological conditioning going on as well in the Western world. Anyway, your average historian is going to be turned off from looking for real answers to certain aspects of history for the simple reason is that right now our technological knowledge and the information that we've currently built up does not really provide an answer. So what you'll find, not only in the mainstream, by the way, but you'll find this in the alternative mainstream as well, what happens is that people start to get filtered. People start to get comfortable with existing information that has, perhaps been proven by the current level of technology that our civilization has. So, they'll start to settle down and they'll get into those areas and they will not budge. So once that person starts to settle down comfortably into an area that seems to provide answers for them, they're not going to move and they will start to defend their position, even if their position is based on falsehoods, lies, half-truths, imaginary crap. Basically, you can create a person who will believe lies and then will, of course, build their entire life on top of said lie. Right, so anyway, I don't even know why I went through all of that. My point is that we do have a very real scientific problem when it comes to the modern day human and their ability to look at history objectively and simply follow evidence. We don't do that anymore. I don't want to say we, I do that. But the vast majority of people, generally in the mainstream, they're no longer interested in looking at new evidence objectively. They're not even interested in looking at old evidence objectively, right? If there is a ready-made answer for your average person is going to take that. So what kind of a position does that put us all in when we are trying to figure out what is going on in history? Because history, for whatever reason, is completely shrouded in darkness and chaos. That fact alone is already weird in and of itself. And I don't think a lot of people truly appreciate how odd it is that everybody on this planet does not have a real good grasp, and I mean a detailed grasp, of our history going back just 3,000 or 4,000 years ago. I know that sounds like a long time, and it is a long time, but for a human, that's something that we should have conquered a long time ago to get information transmitted down the years. And for whatever reason, that didn't happen until very recently. All right, so there's my weird talk about setting the stage. So my 20 minutes, 10 minutes telling you guys that basically all of us humans were kind of screwed due to the civilization that we live in. And I think I've already talked about this once as well, so I just rehashed this. Okay, so the reason why I wanted to bring all of that up was because I want to look at a particular problem in history that may have the potential to explain all kinds of things that right now we really don't have good explanations for. And it's not just going to be historical explanations. What I want to talk about today might actually provide biological explanations that could solve problems that biologists right now have with respect to all the life on this planet within the past, let's just say 10,000 years or so. Because biologists have some legitimate issues that they cannot currently explain, although they are not shouting this off the rooftops. But seriously, only in the past, let's say, like I said, 10,000 years or so, and this is mainstream chronology, by the way, and I'm fine with that for now, it doesn't matter. The past 10,000 years, there have been a lot of weird biological oddities. We have seen species literally appear out of nowhere. We have seen entire species vanish literally overnight. Right? There's all kinds of weird problems that biologists have when they look into the past as well, and the very recent past. Normally, when somebody hears biology and they think about, extinctions or animals changing, everybody immediately falls back on the theory of uniformity and thinks that, oh yeah, they must be talking about something that happened 10 billion years ago. No, I'm literally talking about just millennia ago. And these are legitimate scientific problems. All right, so what we're going to discuss might also solve some of those. It will get even more interesting because what we are going to talk about today might actually help explain the current state of human consciousness. Now, I know that might sound crazy, but, the reality is we don't have a good grasp on human consciousness. And I am not going to start getting into all of that stuff right now. We'll talk a little bit about it as we go through the stuff I do want to cover. But human consciousness is a legitimate problem, right? We don't know where it comes from. We have multiple camps who think they have it figured out, but they're all theoretical, right? You have the camp that thinks that, there's the religious camp that it's everybody's a spirit or whatever. Then you have the physical people, the people who believe that consciousness, is completely stored and generated in the brain physically. And then you have another theory, for example, that says that consciousness could be transmitted into the brain, as the brain would be a receiver. And there's other ideas as well. The three I just gave you are more of the popular ones, with the last two being at least based on some science. All right, so let's get into this. Because what the hell am I talking about? How the hell are we going to solve biological problems, historical problems, and the problem of human consciousness simply by looking back and studying our ancestors' histories? So how do we do that? Well, let's start with just looking back at history. what we are going to do is that we will just take a bunch of ancient legends and mythologies, and let's see if they have anything that is similar within their tales. Then let's take the similarities that we find across all the ancient histories, of which there are a metric ton of, and then let's filter them down further. For this particular show, what I want to filter for is any ancient civilization that discusses anything that really has to do with electricity. More to the point, we are going to look for anybody who talks about thunderbolts, lightning, stuff like that. Now, when we start to look at ancient histories, we are going to find the vast majority of cultures do indeed have stories like this. In fact, we actually have an embarrassment of stories and histories that incorporate unbelievably huge lightning strikes to this planet. Cultures from the North American Indians down to all of the various peoples in South America, Australia, New Zealand, you have over there in Asia, all over Asia, all the cultures over there in Africa. Everybody seems to report at a very particular point in time in history that there are a massive amount of lightning strikes hitting this planet. To make matters even more interesting, we aren't looking for just, a basic lightning strike. I'm not talking about a lightning strike that you go outside, you run around with an umbrella hoping you get zapped, and of course it doesn't happen because you're not lucky enough. I'm not talking about those lightning strikes. The lightning strikes that are recorded in the annals of ancient history are on a planetary scale. Those are the ones that we want to look at. But why? Why does it matter if an ancient culture has a thunder story or a lightning story or whatever? Like, who cares? Like, what the hell does that have to do with human consciousness and then biology? What? I'm shutting this garbage off, right? Well, hold on a second, all right? So here's the reason why this is important. Let me set the stage even further. Yes, this show is going to suck, but I'm going to go through with it anyways, because it's something I've been wanting to talk about, and I don't really have a good format for it. But hey, we'll retry it again maybe in a couple years if the channel still exists, and you can say, hey, I listened to the original one that sucked before he deleted it and then killed himself. Okay, so the reason why I want to focus on lightning, specifically lightning, is because lightning is electricity. Or I should say, more to the point, lightning is plasma, which of course conducts electricity. So that's what you see when you see a flash of light and you see the thunder and lightning out there in the clouds. You're seeing a plasma, right? That's a plasma stream. Well, maybe stream is probably not the right word. Anyway, and it conducts electricity, right? We get that. You all understand the basics of it. Not a big deal. Just understand that it is an electrical form. That's a good way to put it. I like that. Anyways, the reason why this is important is because in the 1900s, it was discovered that 99.9% of the universe is made of plasma. That's right, I said plasma. You'll notice I did not say dark energy or dark matter. Why? Why am I not saying that the universe is created of dark matter and dark energy? Everybody knows that dark energy and dark matter consist of 99% of the universe. What the hell are you talking about when it comes to plasma? Don't forget, dark energy and dark matter are nothing but theoretical copes that helps mainstream cosmologists fulfill their desire for an instant gratification when it comes to needing an answer for what the universe is created of. That is all those two concepts are. Dark energy, dark matter, literally do not exist. We have no proof of their existence in the first place. And second of all, there's literally no reason to even postulate that they exist, because we have an entire other scientific theory which is already being tested and being proven correctly, like practically probably on a day-by-day basis, and that is plasma cosmology. We don't need dark energy, and we do not need dark matter. Those two concepts, they just... That is the kind of thing that will make you run out into the streets with some scissors and start just shanking, cosmologists just running out there up to the, running really far over there to the observatory, waiting outside for a cosmologist to show up, and you just tackle them. we will not be allowing ridiculous theories to get in the way of what we are going to talk about today. So, if we come from the basis of everything being a plasma, essentially, 99.9% of the universe being a plasma. Oh, and by the way, you can literally go and even Google this. 99.9% plasma consists of the entire universe. You can find this on the ClearNet. Nobody even argues this. How do you like that? Even the mainstream acknowledges this, which makes their position even more stupid because they're willing to acknowledge that 99.9% of the universe is a plasma, but no, dark energy and dark matter also still magically somehow consist of the universe at 99. It's insane. It is literal insanity, and they should all be institutionalized and injected with random stuff. That is really the only way to deal with people like that. You know what I'm saying? Okay. Anyway, so we find ourselves in a situation to where if we are going to claim that plasma consists of 99.9% of the universe, that means necessarily that electricity must play some sort of role as well in the universe. And sure enough, it has been discovered over the past couple hundred years at least that this is indeed the case. Now, I'm not going to go into all the too crazy cosmological plasma electricity stuff. That's not really for this show. I'm going to stay focused. What I want to focus on is how the human animal, and by extension other life, how has basically all life on this planet been affected by either electrical disturbances or plasmatic disturbances, or basically both combined. I suppose it's probably both combined. You could kind of separate. Anyways, the point is, let's just dumb it down. How the hell has electricity affected the life on this planet? First of all, has it? Second of all, could it? Now, the answer to this is a unanimous yes. All right, so here we go. Electricity has been discovered over the past couple of hundred years, and especially within the last century, to absolutely affect all biological life on this planet. In fact, it's probably, you could really say, a true statement such as all life is electrical. And that's a true statement, right? Because how does our body communicate to all the cells and organs and nerves and stuff like that? It's all through electrical impulses. So, I don't need to argue. Hopefully, I don't have to bring up a diagram and prove that to you guys. You just go look at it. I'm too lazy to make more stuff on it. Everything is electric with respect to life on this planet. And there's no way around it, right? This is a known fact. It is what it is. Because electricity affects life, of course, what started to happen, like I said, especially in this last century, is that scientists started to experiment with electroshock on the human body. Now, what they started to discover was absolutely that not only could you affect the physical body, for example, you can make the body move and twitch in different ways by applying various electrical surges or currents to various parts of the body, but they also started to look into the brain. And of course, there they found a huge network of electrical connections zapping everywhere, making you move around. Potentially. I know it gets weird with the content. Anyway. But the brain is electric. So, of course, scientists were like, well, can we mess with that electricity to influence the human in some way or another? And then, sure enough, experiments immediately started to show progress of that, yes, if you send electrical pulses into various parts of the brain in various ways, you can absolutely not only control motor functions, but you can actually control how the person feels, hell, even how the person thinks. This is a serious discovery. And I really can't say how important it is to understand how insane this discovery was, because basically what scientists found was that you could control a body and a person's mind if you could gain electrical control over their physical brain. This was obviously attractive to all kinds of people in positions of power, so of course there was more experimentation done. And ultimately, at the end of the day, and we'll talk about this stuff in greater depth in another show, that I just want to lay the groundwork here for the consciousness aspect, but what they discovered is that yes, you can actually control the brain at a very fine level electrically and control a person's emotions and actions by gaining this kind of control. Even more interesting, what they found was it's not just direct electrical control that can mess with the human brain and by extension human consciousness, but what they also found is they could do it wirelessly. And so the experiment started up where they were doing micropulses, and then they started sending frequencies, long distances, etc. And they found out all kinds of crazy things that would mess with the human consciousness. One of the more amazing experiments that was done, I believe it was the U.S., maybe it was some U.S. alphabet agency, I believe. And you can actually find these papers out there. Some of the guys came out and released some of this stuff. This is not schizo. This is legitimate science. You can even find better stuff nowadays, I'm sure. But what they found is that you could actually control an individual from anywhere on the planet if you were able to modulate and control certain frequencies in the ionosphere. That's pretty crazy. That's actually fairly insane. But what that shows is that on a worldwide scale, what humans have proven is that we can alter consciousness by grabbing on to the electrical force. Now, where this comes into play with respect to history is this. If we find a point in history to where we have the Earth going through an insane amount of electrical disturbances, is it possible that those electrical disturbances could have permanently altered the human brain, which then would have continued to alter human consciousness? And this would have been done on a global scale. So this concept is crazy, and to make it even more insane is that it is a scientifically sound concept, and not only is it a scientifically sound concept, it is a tested, tried, and true scientific fact. Alright, so if we know that electricity can alter the brain, what would happen if some of these stories that our ancestors recorded dealing with huge planetary-sized lightning strikes against the planet, would that potentially have altered human consciousness on the physical level within their brain? However, it gets even more crazy. So right now, the only thing I'm talking about is simple lightning strikes. I say simple, but can you imagine a planet-sized lightning strike smashing into Earth? This is what our ancestors claim happened, by the way. Like, this is literally their claims. And of course, right now, you could be saying, well, yeah, they're all crazy monkey people. They say all kinds of crazy stuff. How the hell could a planet-sized lightning bolt hit Earth, right? Or a relatively speaking size. I'm not talking like the size of the Earth. That would obviously evaporate Earth. What I mean is like, a huge lightning bolt that would be seen by peoples on opposite sides of a continent, for example. Maybe not quite that far, but basically, it's not a local lightning bolt. This would have been something that came down from space, so you would have had a better opportunity to see it coming down and smashing into Earth, right? This is the kind of events that our ancestors describe happening. Now, if you don't believe it, that's fine, but we're going to take these things at face value. When we hear the North American Indians talking about thunderbirds, we're going to believe them, right? The thunderbirds, they come down, they kill all the animals, they do all kinds of horrific stuff, it's all electricity and all of that stuff, and then they leave. We're going to take that seriously. When we have the people down over there, the Aborigines down in Australia, they have same stories with respect to lightning bolts. We're going to take those seriously, right? Ancient Greeks have those stories. Anyway, everybody has these stories for some weird reason. And these stories are not told in the sense of a local legend, by the way. These lightning bolts are very much in the sky, coming from space and smashing into Earth. And we know this because they say the gods are the ones throwing these lightning bolts. Where do the gods live? Way up in the sky. Sky is space. There's space up there. Anyway, so we have a situation to where our ancestors are describing electrical discharges on a planetary scale. If we take this seriously, that means that if Earth is getting hit by those kinds of electrical charges, or electrical discharges, I should say, that would mean that the Earth's electrical potential would also be altered. And I probably should have started discussing Earth and electromagnetism a little differently. But here, I know, this show sucks. I get it, okay? You don't have to tell me. You can hit the dislike button. I don't care. Dislikes are like vitamins to me. I love them. Okay, anyway, so just so everybody knows, the Earth is an electrically charged body, which is interesting in and of its own right, and really does speak to a lot of other scientific situations that may help explain other problems. Okay, anyway, the Earth is an electrically charged body. We have what we would consider a negative charge. Something that's interesting about Earth and electricity, and this is also acknowledged by the mainstream, so it's not schizo stuff, is that between ground level and the ionosphere, there's actually a potential of 400,000 volts. Essentially, you sitting right where you're sitting, or walking, or listening, or eating, or whatever the hell you're doing, basically you are literally existing in a huge 400,000 potential volt capacitor. Isn't that crazy? And I think it's like, what, every 6 feet or 10 feet or something you go up, it's like another 120 volts. So like where you're at right now, you're literally sitting in a potential to immediately fry you. Now, the reason why you are not fried is because air acts as a dielectric, right? So that's why you're still alive and kicking. But it is interesting to note that you literally live in an electric environment, and there's no way out of that. So if the Earth's electrical potential, or if the Earth's electrical charge were to ever change, could that potentially affect life on this planet? I would posit yes. In fact, I would say it would have to change life on this planet. All right, before we get to that, let's keep kind of laying our foundation. Also, so everybody generally knows that Earth has an electromagnetic field. Now, if you're still adhering to mainstream geology and mainstream science, those guys right now try to make it sound like the Earth's inner core is spinning and it's generating an electrical charge, and that's where the electrical field of Earth is generated from. Purely from the core. You know, it sounds interesting and there's some science behind it that seems like it would work, but ultimately the question always comes down to where the hell is it getting the energy to really create that kind of a charge? So that's where they'll start talking about angular momentum and how the different layers are, you know, swimming around each other and creating the charge and blah, blah, blah. There's all kinds of excuses in that area, but it's all still very theoretical because nothing has been proven, right? We do not have the actual science to prove that that outlook or that particular geological theory is real. All right, so we're going to discard that because we don't need it, because we actually know where the Earth's electromagnetic field comes from, and this was discovered at least in the early 1900s, and then of course completely ignored by mainstream science for a few for all kinds of reasons, which I'm not going to get into. Anyway, where Earth gets its electromagnetic field is from what we call a Birkeland current. A Birkeland current is an external source of electricity that flows straight through the Earth at its poles, and this flowing of electricity is what creates the electromagnetic field. Remember, every time you have current moving around, you generate an electromagnetic shield. So Earth starts to get really complex when you start to look at the electrical nature of our environment. It's actually quite crazy. And the fact that we exist at all is fascinating, by the way. And we'll talk more about that, maybe on this show. I don't know. We'll see where this goes. Like I said, I know this show sucks. I get it. Okay. So we live in an electrical environment, objectively. There's no way around it. So you live in an electrical environment. Your entire body is controlled by electricity, and everything you interact with is essentially electric in nature. Remember, when you break it down to the atomic structure, what are atoms running on, right? You know, the weak and strong force, but what's going on there? Those forces are an electric force. So even down to the fundamentals, it's there, right? And nobody wants to put these things together in the mainstream. And the main reason why is because it would immediately destroy quite a lot of their outlooks, right? Right now, it would immediately get rid of dark energy and dark matter, right? Those people would no longer have jobs. It just gets rid of all kinds of problems. It gets rid of black holes. It gets rid of the Big Bang. It gets rid of planetary composition and how planets are built in the mainstream. The accretion disk model, which is trash, by the way. Anyway, we know for a fact that we live in an electrically charged environment. All right, so what does that mean for human consciousness? Now, as I said earlier, there are several different approaches to trying to quantify human consciousness, right? You have the religious and you have the scientific, and the scientific basically boils down to either purely physicality, consciousness is completely generated in the brain, or the other side of things, which also shows a lot of scientific promise based on experimentation, is that the brain is only a receiver. And the brain simply receives consciousness from, who knows where. I don't know. I don't have an answer for that whatsoever. But it's fascinating. Either way, doesn't matter which one of those two are true or anything else, we still have to acknowledge the electrical nature of the brain. And by extension, we then have to ask the question, if Earth was pelted by planet-sized lightning bolts only a few thousand years, could that have changed the electrical nature of the planet? And then by extension, would that or could that have changed human consciousness? Now, I would posit, yes, that this actually probably did happen to some degree or another. Why do I say that? Remember, at some point in time in this show, I made the point that it was discovered that you can control another person's brain by using direct electrical current, or AC current as well, it doesn't matter. You can play with both ones. Or you can also mess with somebody's brain using radio frequencies. You can mess with the frequency on how the brain operates, how it processes information by messing with the natural frequency of the brain. And then of course, if you can really, isolate certain areas and you can transmit certain frequencies to mess with certain stuff, it gets crazy. Another great example of what was discovered is that you can actually transmit thoughts and words into somebody's heads. You can actually transmit a voice into somebody's head. This kind of puts a different spin on schizo, right? So it's entirely possible that all the voices that keep yelling at me to do things on this channel are completely controlled by somebody outside. I don't know. It's completely possible. But that's the thing. This is a literal scientific property that was discovered. You can directly transmit human voice into the brain. It's fascinating stuff. Anyway, so if we find a period of time to where we have these huge thunderbolts going on, that would mean that the Earth's electrical environment would necessarily have to change. Why do I say that? The environment would have to change because the only reason why we are getting zapped is because the electrical environment of the solar system itself is trying to find its equilibrium. So if Earth is carrying more of a charge or lesser of a charge and it flies by some other body with a greater or lesser charge, those two bodies are going to essentially zap each other. It's just like if you were to run around your house in your underwear, right? You rub your feet on the floor, and then you run outside, you find your closest neighbor, and you start zapping him. Just take that, you stupid. You start kicking him on the ground. He's on the ground all electrified and smoking, just like, ah! It's like that. Essentially, what happens is when two charged bodies who have distinctly different charges come close to one another, electricity is self-organizing. So what it does is that it looks for the lowest possible potential, and then it tries to get there. The way it gets there is by zapping, or basically sending a stream of electrons from one area to another. This appears to have happened during a very specific time in history. This period of time is what I'm right now calling the Venus event, right? This name might change later as we learn more and things might change. But right now, by all intents and purposes, it sounds like all of our ancestors agree that the planet Venus was just a few thousand years ago in a cometary form and actually did a few flybys of Earth. On one of these flybys, at least one of them, it could have happened a few times, the two planetary bodies got close enough to where they essentially electrically saw each other. So once they electrically see each other, they start talking, and the way they talk is by shooting out thunderbolts from one planet to the other to try to neutralize the electrical environment. Now, I'm keeping this on a very basic level. There's a lot of stuff going on here. But anyways, this kind of a situation is exactly what our ancestors are describing. Even more interesting, and to give them more, proof or more support, is that all of the cultures all over the planet that discuss this particular event, they really do discuss it in a scientific kind of way. The observations that they make are the exact kind of effects we would expect them to see if this actually happened in real life. So right now you're probably wondering, well, are you talking about the planet Venus, bro? Really? Yeah, it's entirely possible that our solar system had not found its current orbital situation that it has now, that it was still trying to figure it out back in the day. And by all intents and purposes, our ancestors make that claim as well. All right, so anyway, we have a situation to where Earth's electrical potential can be slapped around. So if this planetary event, right, this event where Venus does a flyby of Earth, zaps the crap out of it, and changes the electrical charge, could that have potentially messed with the human psyche? And I would say, yeah, it probably did. I don't see how it couldn't. So what's even more interesting is that when we start to look at these histories, if we start to think, all right, fine, if something happened to Earth electrically that literally messed with humans and all animals on the planet, I mean, what was the effect? What was the difference? What changed? One of the main things that we find that changed is what I started talking about at the very beginning of this show. And that's the problem of us essentially not knowing anything that happened in the more recent past. I mean, what the hell happened? It's a legitimate problem that humans did not, we're not able to create and store historical information on a grander scale. Now, I realize we can blame some things like people burning libraries or, just second law of thermodynamics, just basic stuff. But on the whole, things don't make sense from a human perspective if we are only going to go back, say, 3, 4, 5, 10,000 years ago. And there's a few things that we run into, or a few problems that we end up running into. The first problem that we run into is human population sizes. Humans proliferate very quickly. And I've covered and talked about this before, but there's no reason to believe that humans had this extraordinarily short lifespan, thousands and thousands of years ago, and that's why their populations never made it. We have no reason to believe that. Right now, we can literally look at populations on this planet that don't have access to things like first world medical care, and they are outbreeding the entire planet. So we know for a fact that, for example, advanced Medicare does not really have any bearing on human population. Something else had to have happened to the population in the first place to keep humans down. Right now, what do we got, like 8, 9 billion people on the planet right now or something? It's getting crazy, right? Why didn't we have this situation, thousands of years ago? It doesn't make sense. It makes no sense. However, if we find a situation like our ancestors claim, that the world was being hit by tons of catastrophes, then you have a thing that could get rid of human populations and stop human growth, right? And that would also physically destroy any of the histories that humans had recorded, more or less, up until that point in time. Now, the even more crazier part of it, the psychological part, is fascinating to think about. And this is still an ongoing situation. But I just want to throw it out there for you to think about. And I'll keep touching base on this as this channel progresses. Because, anyway, here's the other thing. For whatever reason, it really does appear that the human race essentially got mind-wiped when it comes to their history. Look around right now around your general society. How many people really take seriously any of their ancestors' ancient legends or mythologies? Even worse, how many people even know them? The vast majority of humans, especially in the first world, but it's really all over the planet, for some weird reason, really have this negative affinity when it comes to looking back at certain points in time in our past. It's almost like we are a species with amnesia. Now, I know that's a Graham Hancock thing, and he stole that from Immanuel Velikovsky, all right? That's straight up. But that claim might actually be true. Why might that be true? For two reasons. The first reason is that if any of these catastrophes took place, what could have potentially, or I would, guarantee did happen to the human populations on this planet, is that human populations were traumatized to the very core of their being. And of course, those are only the survivors, and the vast majority of people were wiped out. But if you survived that, the traumatic events of those cataclysms would have absolutely affected you psychologically. To make matters even more interesting, while you are being psychologically manipulated by the trauma of the catastrophes, you are then essentially also getting electroshock therapy simply because of the events that are happening. Now, one of the things that it's important to know is that electroshock therapy, well, we call it therapy, but electroshocks to the brain are one of the most effective ways to alter the way a person thinks. This is why when you ever get into brainwashing techniques and stuff like that, you'll find electricity plays an unbelievably huge role in getting the subject to do what the controller wants them to do. There's all kinds of methods that come into play when you deal with electricity, but electricity is key. So if we have an electrically charged environment and that charged environment changes, is it possible that literally the entire planet's population received an intense electroshock therapy while simultaneously witnessing a traumatic event? That right there is essentially a psychological conditioner's dream, right? Because there's two different kinds of things going on simultaneously here. We've already kind of covered all the electroshock therapy part of the science, so we know we can mess with the human brain like that. The other side of this, the traumatic event, that is also one of the best ways to control a person as well. We call this trauma-based conditioning. What happens is, if you can expose a human to a horrific event, some way that creates psychological trauma and potentially physical trauma as well, they both work hand in hand. You don't necessarily need to inflict physical trauma to do this, but it helps. I mean, so anyway, when you have a person who is being electroshocked and suffering from extreme trauma delivered to them by the act of the cataclysm. Now, the trauma that the person would have been receiving from that cataclysm would have been from several directions. The first direction is the obvious, right? If you have a giant thunderbolt coming down and smashing into the earth, I guarantee it that you will have a completely different outlook on your life. I mean, just imagine seeing another planet approaching Earth. Just imagine seeing Venus coming close to Earth. I guarantee you would have what would probably be akin to a understanding of God. Like, the level of humbleness that you would feel as a human would be absolutely insane and incredibly traumatic. Just from seeing the planet, just from considering the potential terror of what that means, seeing that planetary body in the sky. So that's the first part of the trauma. The next part of the trauma is the actual event itself that hits Earth. Right? Once you have that huge planet-wide thunderbolt coming out of Venus and smashing into Earth, once again, you are going to be humbled on a completely new level, on a level that you may have never thought was possible. Right? Now, so that's already two extraordinarily crazy traumatic events that are scrambling your mind and getting it prepped for the future. The next thing you will then have to start dealing with is the trauma of watching your friends die, your family die, your entire city or village or whatever get wiped out. That's another trauma that people would have been suffering. And then ultimately, the most intense trauma, and this would be the threat on your own existence. If you can truly threaten somebody's life, and I mean get them to the point to where they truly understand that they are about to die, I mean that's going to change everything for anybody. Once you get them to that point, if you can pull them away from it, you will have an amazing amount of control over that person if you manage it correctly. Now, obviously, there's nobody here managing the entire planet as everybody was being psychologically traumatized and slapped around. So whatever would have happened would have been an outcome of their environment. So I'm willing to bet that you mix these two events. You mix the trauma-based conditioning as well with essentially the electroshock conditioning, and you create a situation to where that human being that is being affected essentially becomes a blank slate. So whatever would have been going on around them would have dictated how they were going to create their new mental state. And without anybody there to guide them, I guarantee you what happened is that immediately, the vast majority, if not maybe all humans to one degree or another, the vast majority of humans would have immediately disassociated themselves from the horrific events that they just experienced. Disassociation is a common tactic that the brain uses to get the person to essentially move on with life. It's a defense mechanism. Because after somebody goes through so much trauma, and of course being electroshocked simultaneously, that is going to be way too hard on the psyche of that person. The only way that that person, in a lot of cases, is going to be able to carry on is if they disassociate and repress all of those memories. So what we could have potentially had, and one of the reasons why we may not have as good of a grasp on our history than we really should have, in my opinion, is the fact that all of our ancestors were psychologically conditioned and electroshocked by the universe to forget all of these events. Isn't that crazy? But everything I just said right there, that's all based on science. Like not a single thing that I just said is any kind of like schizo stuff. It's not, theoretical. All of that stuff is literal science. So we cannot ignore that as historians. We cannot ignore what may have potentially happened in our past. If our ancestors make the claims, and those claims line up with scientific principles as well as scientific evidence on this planet itself, for example, by the way, just in case anybody thinks that a huge thunderbolt could not have hit Earth, it's entirely possible that the Grand Canyon was not caused or carved by the Colorado River. Unbelievably ridiculous. It was not carved by some random flood from the Bible. No, that's also ridiculous. Doesn't even make sense anyways. I don't know why Christian people or Bible people push that angle. So weird. Anyway, the Grand Canyon is a dendritic form. That is exactly the kind of shape that we would get if a bolt of electricity smashed into the area. You would get a dendritic formation. So if you ever think that, nothing was hitting Earth, we have the geological evidence to prove it. Right? There's all kinds of dendritic forms all over the Earth. Even more interesting, for example, another good example is the Richat structure. Richat, I don't know how you pronounce it. Everybody keeps trying to say that it's Atlantis. It's not Atlantis. It's literally a lightning strike location. You can literally see where the electricity and plasma hit it and the shape that it made. There's no reason to believe that's an ancient city. It's just a scar from one of these plasma strikes. That's all it is. Very simple, very scientific. We don't need to go schizo on that. Anyway, that's the proof that's some of them. There's tons of proof, by the way. It's all over this planet. But there you go. Like, this stuff potentially happened, and we have all of the scientific evidence to support it. So, it's entirely possible that our ancestors were psychologically broken, and then over time slowly rebuilt themselves as the generations continued. Now, there's one more interesting aspect that we have to deal with when it comes to these disassociated memories, or these repressed memories. And this is where things can get a little weird, and it's not speculation, but it's not 100% totally proven yet, but we're on our way and well, it's kind of proven. It's weird. Anyway, there's another aspect of memories. If the trauma was so insane, was so intense, that the very DNA of humans may actually contain that repressed memory. So what I mean by that is that future generations came along and had no way of actually truly being able to deal with the possibility of those events happening, not just because they didn't believe it because it sounded fantastical, but because of genetics. it's entirely possible that there was a genetic memory that has also been scarred into all of our DNA that makes it to where those kind of events remain repressed even in us today. How do you like that? So basically what I'm saying is, can DNA hold memory? Now, before you think this is schizo, before you think that this is not possible, this is a real study in genetics. There's a lot of science out there regarding this, but what I'll say more to the point before we move on is that we actually do have evidence that memory can be passed on by genetics. We find this in the monarch butterfly. Science proved quite a while ago that the DNA of a monarch butterfly will transmit memory. How do you like that? And that memory transmits through their metamorphosis cycle too, right? They come out as a little worm or caterpillar, and then they go cocoon up, turn into a goo, and then become a butterfly. That memory persists across that entire process. Isn't that insane? As an interesting side note, in the middle of the 1900s, the CIA enacted a mind control program called Project Monarch. Did you ever wonder why they called it Project Monarch? Like, why not name it something else? Was this a random name? What was this? The reason why it was named Project Monarch is for the reasons I just mentioned. They discovered that essentially psychological programming could indeed potentially be transferred from mother to child, and so on down the generations. Which means you could essentially create in the future whatever kind of human you want if you can program whatever you want into them and then have that programming persist and populate on its own. Imagine the power behind that kind of technology. This stuff is real science. And the people who are involved in that, all of the victims, let's be honest, they're victims. I don't even want to know how many people lost their mind and ultimately lost their life due to that program. It's serious business. Anyway, so that just puts the icing on the cake for that kind of a situation that could have potentially happened to our ancestors in the past. This is not schizo. This is a legitimate potential possibility, and it's something that needs to be taken seriously. It's interesting because once you do take it seriously, a lot more of history will start to come into focus. And all of that is based on science, right? All right, we're coming up on an hour, so I just want to go over a couple more concepts, and then I'll let you go. Then you can go back to, I don't know, looking for prostitutes or hunting geologists like me. Feel free to join me, it's fine. I love having hunting partners. We go and we stalk campuses like Predator, and then we use the exact same tools too as Predator. In fact, I like dressing up as Predator and going to college campuses wherever the geological department is, and then we simply stalk geologists. It's good times. Okay, anyway. Blah, blah, blah. Okay, so the last thing we need to talk about with respect to electricity is how it could potentially affect consciousness. Now, the consciousness problem is a very interesting one, and I don't have time to go over a lot of the depth and details here, but suffice to say is that we don't have a lot of answers here anyway. So, we'll do another show later on this to give you guys more details, but this is an area that has tons of room for growth. So, for those of you out there who are into the psychological aspect of stuff and consciousness, I recommend factoring in the electrical potential of the Earth. Factor in the frequencies of the Birkeland current, factor in the magnetic field, etc., etc. I believe if you were to start doing that, especially those of you who are way better at this stuff than me, this is, everybody's better than me at everything. Shut up! Right? But if you were to factor that stuff into your thoughts or discussions with respect to understanding consciousness, I think it would open a lot of doors. So it begs the question, if our consciousness did indeed change because the electrical potential of the planet changed back in the day, what the hell were our ancestors like, a few thousand years ago before the Venus event hit Earth? It's a good question. It also brings up maybe the possibility of starting to explain, say, things like the pyramids, or things like Baalbek, or whatever megalithic structures existed. It's entirely possible that whoever existed back in the day simply had possibly a higher level of consciousness, and they were able to think on higher levels than we are able to think now. right? That's an entire possibility. In fact, I would actually bet a lot of money on that anyway, because nowadays, with all of the different kind of things that we have to deal with, chemicals in our foods, all the frequencies now flying around in the air, messing with us. Remember, like I said, you can transmit into the brain. That is not a schizo thing. That is a legit scientific fact. Right? We have all this crap going on, so we have already necessarily been dumbed down. So it's impossible, or not impossible, it's possible that our ancestors were operating simply on a higher level of intellect. And so building something like the pyramids or Baalbek or any of these huge megalithic situations, that would not have been a problem for them because they could figure it out on other levels that we are just not operating on, right? So, and it also begs the question, what kind of philosophy did they have? What kind of thoughts did they have if they were able to operate at a higher level? Just some crazy stuff to think about, right? Anyway, that's potentially possible. Now, let's transition into the biological, and then I will for sure let you go. So, if we take the Venus event seriously, and we do indeed have electrical charges being exchanged between cosmological bodies, the next question we can ask on the biological front is how does that affect humans and animals? If we are exchanging charge, and if Earth is the receiving body of said charge, and that's the way it sounds like everybody describes Venus zapping Earth. What that means is that Earth would have taken on more of a charge as it was trying to accommodate to its electrical environment. What does that mean? Well, what that essentially means is that 3,000 or 4,000 years ago, potentially earlier, depending on the chronology you look at, that means that at a certain point in time, the Earth would have gained mass instantaneously from that electrical exchange. This is where things get insane, and we'll do another show on this particularly because it is amazing and might actually answer quite a lot of our historical and biological questions. But look at this. So when a charge is exchanged, and if Earth was the receiver, what happens when what is Earth receiving, right? We're getting a zap, but why? What's going on? We're getting zapped with more electrons. And in this case, we would have been zapped with a ton of electrons. And, of course, as everybody should know, electrons have mass. So if Venus transferred a ton of electrons to Earth, what would have happened to Earth? Earth would have immediately gained in mass. What happens when something gets more massive? Gravity gets stronger. How do you like this? It's entirely possible that our ancestors lived on a planet whose gravity was not as great as it is now. Imagine if 2,000 or 3,000 or 4,000 years ago, everything was a little lighter on this planet. What would that entail? Well, suddenly moving all those blocks to build a pyramid is not as difficult as it would be right now. If you are able to make those megalithic stones lighter, not because of some weird technology, we don't need gravity rays or sound vibrating things and levitate, we don't need any of that. What if Earth's gravitational field was simply not as strong? That changes everything, doesn't it? It also changes biology too, doesn't it? Because if suddenly you do not have the same gravity that we have right now on Earth, that means larger animals could exist. One of the reasons why we don't have, like a brontosaurus or some of those huge megalithic creatures that people talk about that are all extinct walking around nowadays is because the gravity that Earth currently has literally could not support their bulk. And that's just a simple fact. So unfortunately, sorry for all of you who love, those dinosaur movies like Jurassic Park and crap, all of that stuff is technically impossible. None of those animals would be able to exist under our current gravitational situation. So it begs the question, how do we have bones and fossils and other kinds of findings that support the science that says, hey, yeah, look, huge animals used to roam around on this planet? this appears to be a scientific fact. We have the evidence that it's there, but it still begs the question, if they could not have physically existed in our current gravity, that necessarily means that Earth's gravitational force had to be different in the past. Don't you just love science? Right, we started with stuff that sounds fantastical, but at the end of the day, all of the historic, scientific, archaeological, whatever, all of the evidence that we currently have literally supports the claims of our ancestors when they talk about these horrible catastrophes hitting Earth. Now, it's funny to watch mainstream scramble with this, right? So, for example, the dinosaur situation. I don't have an opinion on dinosaurs right now. This is actually something I don't get dinosaurs anymore. That whole thing is weird. I'm not saying they didn't exist, but it's just a weird problem. Like, okay, anyway, we'll talk about that later. But anyway, even mainstream scientists, they now acknowledge this problem, right? You can't have a brontosaurus running around nowadays. There's no way. It's physically impossible. It can't be done. So what they've done is they've started to say things like, oh, well, those sauropods, they must have been waterborne. Why? Why do they have to be waterborne? Why do they have to live in water? Well, for one simple reason. You cannot support that kind of weight with a physical body without something else helping support the weight. In this case, water would be helping to support the brontosaurus's weight. Now, of course, that doesn't even make sense anyways, because an animal as large as a brontosaurus would immediately sink into the mud and dirt and stuff like that of the water that they were walking in. So the whole situation is really weird for mainstream science, and even us as well. I mean, like I said, I don't have answers for like what the hell the dinosaurs were, when they lived, how all of that stuff happened, but what we can say for a fact is that the Earth's current gravitational situation could not have existed for sure millions of years ago, if you believe the millions of year thing for dinosaurs. I don't know any more about the dinosaur chronology, by the way. That's a whole weird subject. I already said that like twice. Okay. But we do not have to look back millions of years ago for a time where gravity may have been different. We can just look a few thousand years ago, because we know for a fact that there were larger animals around that time period wandering around on the Earth, right? You have all these woolly mammoths, woolly rhinoceroses, all these gigantic animals wandering around. It begs the question, if Earth's gravity is like it is now, why did life essentially prefer to have huge, all these gigantic animals when, the environment doesn't really support it in a good way? Well, what if the environment did support those kinds of body types way better than it does now? This would also help to explain why we do not find any of these animals alive today either. Right? It's not just that a catastrophe rolled through and smashed everything up and killed like everything, just made so many species extinct. There's that problem, right? That sucks, and that obviously helped make all the animals extinct. But where are the survivors? I mean, there were survivors. We know that for a fact. There were animals that survived this thing. How come they were not able to repopulate? Well, after this catastrophe, they may not have been physically able to survive on the new environment of Earth because the gravity had increased to a point to where their hulking masses were no longer supported. So if the environment no longer supports larger life forms, what's going to happen? Yeah, they're going to go extinct. And that is also exactly what we find. These catastrophes, while extraordinarily thorough on the physical aspect, of the destruction aspect, right? You've got fire raining down from the sky. You've got huge tidal waves, miles high in the sky. You have mountains being ripped up out of the earth. While all of that absolutely slaughtered hundreds of millions of animals, not all of them died. But the survivors had no way of adapting to their new environment after all of that, because the gravitational environment was no longer suited to their body size. How do you like science now? See, when we apply practical and real science, we start to get real answers. The only reason why nobody in the mainstream is looking at this stuff is very simple. They have all been psychologically conditioned to immediately discard anything that does not coincide with their current world view. And we've gone over that a million times, but that's it. Everything I've said so far on this channel, or in this show, well, on the channel too, but everything in this show is based on testable science, and that's the beauty. It's testable, right? We can do that. You can do that right now, right? A lot of the stuff the mainstream has, they can't do any of it. It's all theoretical. All right, I'll let you go, but one more interesting thing I want to throw out there, and then we're done because I'm hungry. If Earth's gravitational field was lighter 2,000 or 3,000 years ago, or 4, whatever the date is, not only would we have had larger flora and fauna on the Earth, which is exactly what we find in the fossil record, we also could have potentially had a situation to where larger humans could have existed. When we look back in every ancient culture's past, well, I'll say almost every ancient culture's past, but it's pretty much everywhere. Everybody, for some weird reason, has stories that giants were real. And these giants were between 7 feet, upwards of 12 to 15 to 18 feet. And even larger ones, depending on the stories you're willing to entertain. Now, right now, the concept of human giants sounds stupid because we don't have human giants running around, and it just doesn't exist. We have no frame of reference to say, yeah, that's possible, right? It's not there. We have a couple of people out there that exist with a pituitary gland problem, apparently, and that's why they might get a little bigger. But otherwise, we don't have giant humans walking around. But the question is, the whole thing is a problem, because why do we have a situation to where all of our ancestors not only record the concept of giants and giants existing, but they also record giants building a lot of the ruins that we have now on Earth, a lot of the megalithic structures, that's in their histories. We have giants interacting with all of these people, whether it be negative or positive, but all of our ancestors' histories all have these descriptions. If it was, say, 1 or 2 cultures that talked about this stuff, fine, we could throw it aside and relegate it to the past. The problem is everybody talks about giants existing. Why don't they exist right now? Well, like I said about the larger animals, if Earth went through a period to where Earth's gravitational field increased, just like a woolly mammoth or a bigger animal would suffer under that kind of gravity, so would a larger human. What makes this even more fascinating is that our ancestors' histories literally talk about this exact thing happening. Because what happens is that the further back you go, giants are tall, big, and very strong, and smart in a lot of ways too, really smart. Then as time progresses and as cataclysms happen and as things change, what happens is that the giant humans start to move slower, they start to die off, and this is exactly what we would expect to see if the gravitational field had increased. So basically what we find is that our ancestors' histories literally line up with the science that potentially proves that Earth's gravitational field was just a little lighter only a few thousand years ago. Now I say just a little lighter. I have no clue, how strong it was prior to the Venus event. But if it was weaker than it is now, that would allow all kinds of options to be opened for all kinds of life forms to exist. Suddenly, all that crazy stuff that we see within our ancestors' histories and stories and legends and mythologies, suddenly everything that they talk about starts to become a real scientific possibility.